I was on my back under a '68 Ford F-100, covered in rust flakes and old grease, when a pair of heels stopped 3 feet from my face. Not work boots, not sneakers, heels, the kind you'd see walking into a Bay Street law office in Toronto, not a restoration garage off the highway outside Guelph. I slid out from under the truck and squinted up. A woman stood in the bay entrance, holding a leather portfolio against her chest like a shield. She was maybe early 40s, wearing a charcoal blazer over a silk blouse. And she was looking at my garage the way most people looked at a parking ticket. Like it was real, and she still couldn't believe it. "We're closed for walk-ins," I said. "I know," I called ahead. "Your assistant said you'd be here until 7. "My assistant is my dog. He can't actually talk." She didn't smile. "Are you Seth Calloway?" I wiped my hands on a rag that didn't help and sat up straighter against the truck. "Depends on what you're selling." "I'm not selling anything." She stepped farther into the bay, and the overhead light caught her face properly. She looked tired in the specific way that money couldn't fix. The kind of tired that came from carrying something heavy for too long without being able to put it down. "My name is Clara Whitmore." That name landed differently than most. In southern Ontario, Whitmore meant Whitmore Estate Holdings, old farmland turned boutique hotel. A heritage inn on the Niagara Escarpment that showed up in every travel piece about wine country. A renovated grain mill in Elora that had won some architectural preservation award 2 years ago. My uncle had taken his wife there for their anniversary. He'd called it the most beautiful building he'd ever eaten dinner inside. I got to my feet slowly. "All right, what can I do for Whitmore?" Clara's grip on the portfolio tightened. "I need a husband before Monday." The compressor kicked on somewhere in the back of the shop. My guy Trevor dropped something metal in the next bay and swore quietly. Neither sound helped with what I just heard. "Lady," I said, "I fix trucks." "I know what you do." She set the portfolio on the hood of the F-100 without asking, opened it, and turned it toward me. "My grandfather's estate includes a succession clause. If I'm not in a legal marriage by Monday morning, interim control of Whitmore Estate Holdings transfers to my uncle Gerald for a minimum of 18 months. I looked at the papers. I didn't read them, just looked at the fact that they existed. And Gerald is a problem. Gerald has 3 buyers lined up for the Elora Mill, the Escarpment Inn, and the stone farmhouse property we've been restoring in Prince Edward County. He's had them lined up for 6 weeks. He's been waiting for this clause to activate. I knew the Elora Mill. You couldn't work in heritage restoration in this province without knowing it. Hand-cut limestone, original timber frame, wheel housing they'd kept intact as a feature. Somebody had done serious work on that building. The thought of it being stripped and flipped made something tighten in my chest that had nothing to do with Clara Whitmore standing in my bay. "Why me?" I asked. She pulled a single page from the portfolio and held it up. I didn't move to take it. 8 months ago, Gerald's holding company tried to purchase this property through a numbered corporation out of Mississauga. You turned it down. I went still. That was him. He offered significantly over market value. This was my grandfather's shop. "I know." She put the page back. "I needed someone Gerald couldn't approach the same way. Someone he couldn't flatter, pressure, or make an offer to that would actually work." I looked past her at the street. August evening in Guelph. The sky was going orange over the rooftops. A normal Tuesday before 30 seconds ago. "You researched me." "I had to." "You wanted to make sure I fit." "Yes." I didn't like that. I didn't like her standing in my grandfather's garage, knowing about the offer I'd turned down, knowing things about a place I'd never talked about to anyone outside this building. What do I get out of this? Financial compensation, clearly outlined. A legal agreement that protects your business, your property, your name. Independent counsel of your choosing. Clean dissolution terms at the end. I didn't ask about money. She stopped. For the first time since she'd walked in, something shifted in her expression. "What did you ask about?" "The truth," I said. "All of it, not the version you prepared for someone who might say no." Clara looked out the bay door at the evening light, then back at me. Her voice dropped by about half a register. The mill was my grandmother's project. She spent 11 years restoring it before she died. My grandfather didn't care about the work or the history. He cared about her. After she passed, he didn't know what to do with any of it, so he put it in the estate with a clause that sounded like protection, but was really just grief wearing a legal suit. She pressed her fingers against the edge of the portfolio. Gerald will sell those buildings in pieces before spring. He doesn't see what they are. He only sees what they're worth per square foot. The shop was quiet, except for the compressor. Old buildings didn't lie. Either the bones held, or they didn't. Clara Whitmore was standing in front of me like a woman who had been holding up a wall with her back for so long, she'd forgotten what it felt like to stand straight. "This drags my name into your family situation," I said. "Yes." "My shop, my crew." "Yes." "And if it goes sideways, people aren't going to say you chose me because I was the right person. They'll say you bought a guy from a garage." She held my gaze. "I know that." I watched her for another few seconds. "All right." She blinked. "All right? I'll hear the rest. But I have one condition." I picked up the rag again and set it on the F-100's running board. "Before we talk about anything legal, you come here. The shop. You meet the people this affects." She looked down at her blazer, then at the oil stain on the concrete floor between us. "Fine." "Not fine, you stand where I stand first. Then we talk about courthouses." Something crossed her face that I couldn't name yet. Not relief exactly. More like recognition. "When?" "Tomorrow morning, 7. I have a conference call at 7, I said. "Oh, we're done here." She closed the portfolio. 7. In the next bay, Trevor had gone very quiet, in the way that meant he'd heard everything, and was trying not to exist. I drove home that night and sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that went cold while I stared at nothing. My place was small. A century home I'd been slowly restoring myself. 2 blocks from the shop. Original pine floors. Plaster walls I'd patched instead of drywalling over. A kitchen that needed better lighting and probably always would because I kept meaning to fix it and kept getting to it last. I had a quiet life. My crew, the trucks, the buildings, the slow satisfaction of finding the right piece of old wood to match what was already there. I didn't need complicated. I also knew what the Elora mill looked like. I'd driven past it twice, just to look at the stonework. Clara showed up at 7:02. I noted the 2 minutes, because it meant she'd been in the parking lot at 7, and made herself wait, which told me something. She was dressed down by her standards. Dark jeans, a blazer that was less formal than the night before. But she was still wearing shoes that didn't belong anywhere near a shop floor. She looked at the building from the lot for a moment before she came in. Trevor was already at the bandsaw. Across the floor, my other guy Danny was sorting hardware at the back bench. They both looked up when Clara walked in. Trevor's expression went carefully neutral. Danny didn't bother hiding that he was curious. I introduced her directly. No title, no explanation. "This is Clara, she's here because she asked me to do something, and I told her she had to meet you first." Trevor set down what he was holding and looked at her straight. "Is Seth in some kind of trouble?" "She's the one with the trouble," I said. Clara didn't flinch. "That's accurate." Trevor looked at her for a long moment. "What kind?" "Family, money, a clause in an estate that someone's planning to exploit." "And Seth's involved how?" "I asked him to be." Trevor nodded slowly, like that was a reasonable answer, then looked at me. "She know what she's getting into?" "She's starting to," I said. I walked her through the whole shop. The mill joiner we used for matching heritage profiles. The cabinet of salvaged hardware sorted by period and region. The wall of photographs. Buildings before and after, some spanning years of work. She stopped in front of the photos longer than I expected. "This is the church in Fergus," she said, touching the edge of a before shot. Collapsed roof, stone walls standing. 18 months of work. Didn't touch the original stone except to repoint. "I know this building." She looked at me. My grandmother attended services there when she was a girl. I didn't say anything to that. At 8:30, she stood in the middle of the shop floor and looked at Danny showing an apprentice how to read grain direction in a piece of reclaimed fur. She watched for a minute without speaking. These people have families, I said. Mortgages. One of them's got a kid starting university in September. Gerald comes after me. He makes their lives harder too. I understand. You're starting to. She didn't argue. That was the moment I decided she wasn't performing. At 10, she handed me a card for a lawyer named Marianne Sauve, who had never worked with Whitmore Holdings and had been arranged specifically for my independent review. At 11, I was sitting across from Marianne in her office on Wyndham Street, while Clara waited on a bench outside the glass door and didn't check her phone once, which I respected more than I probably should have. Marianne walked me through every page. My shop was mine. My property was mine. The house was mine. If this came apart, I had 3 separate legal protections between my name and the fallout. She looked at me over her reading glasses at one point and said, "You understand this arrangement is highly unusual." I've gathered that. It is, however, legally sound on its face, provided both parties are entering voluntarily and with full information. I have full information, I said. More than I wanted by this point. She almost smiled, then sign where indicated. On Friday we were at the courthouse in Guelph. No flowers, no guests. A registrar with reading glasses and a quiet office, Clara's lawyer, mine, and the 2 of us standing close enough that I could tell she'd stopped sleeping properly sometime in the last week. You both understand the legal nature of this union? The registrar asked. Yes, Clara said. I said, I do, apparently. She looked sideways at me. It was the first crack in the careful composure she'd been maintaining for 3 days. Then the registrar asked about rings, and Clara went still in a way that made her lawyer step slightly forward. I didn't arrange, she started. I reached into my jacket pocket. It was a stupid impulse. I'd had my grandfather's ring on the kitchen windowsill for 4 years, the one he'd worn every day in this shop, until his hands got too swollen from arthritis, and he had to take it off. I kept it, where I could see it every morning when I made coffee. When I'd gone home the night before and stood at the sink, I'd looked at it for a long time, and then in the morning I'd put it in my pocket without entirely knowing why. I opened my palm. It was a plain silver band scratched from 40 years of work, slightly out of round from how often he'd gripped tools over it. Clara looked at it like I'd done something she hadn't prepared for. We can use something else. I can have Gordon. It's fine, I said. We can take it back after. She picked it up carefully. When she slid it onto my finger, her hand wasn't steady. Not much. Enough that I felt it. I looked at her, and for a moment the registrar's office got quieter than it had any reason to be. It wasn't love. It wasn't even close to trust yet. But the ring was real weight. My grandfather's ring on my hand, and a woman's fingers leaving mine after putting it there. The registrar confirmed we were married. By 2 in the afternoon, we were in a boardroom in a glass office building in Kitchener, and Gerald Whitmore was already seated at the far end of the table when we walked in. He was maybe 65, the kind of well-dressed that was specifically designed to communicate that he did not need to try. He looked at me like he was reading a quote on something he didn't plan to buy. Clara, he said, this is a surprise even for you. She set the marriage certificate on the table. The clause has been satisfied. Gerald's gaze moved to me. You hired a mechanic? Restoration contractor, I said. Silence. Restoration contractor, I said again, the same way. If you're going to reduce what I do, use the right word for it. One of the older people at the table lowered her eyes quickly. Gerald folded his hands. And you expect the board to accept that this is a genuine arrangement? I expect the board to read the documentation, I said. What you accept is your business. Clara's lawyer stepped in on cue and laid out the certificate, the registration, the timing, the independent counsel notes, every clean legal line. The board chair, a woman named Patricia Feld, read everything twice. Gerald watched Clara the whole time, not the documents. "This is a circus," he said. Clara's voice didn't change. "This is a family company. I kept it one." That landed. Patricia Feld folded her hands, looked at the documents a final time and said, "The condition has been satisfied. Voting control remains with Clara Whitmore." Gerald stood, buttoned his jacket, and looked at me. "Enjoy the arrangement, Mr. Calloway." "Enjoy the loss," I said. Clara's hand found my arm under the table before I could add anything. Gerald left. For about 6 minutes, I thought that was it. Then Clara's phone lit up. Then her lawyer's. Then Patricia's assistant came through the door, with the expression of someone who had just watched something bad start. Clara turned her screen toward me. A post on a local news aggregator, already getting shared. A family source, claiming the Whitmore marriage was a legal fiction arranged to circumvent the estate clause. My full name spelled correctly. Her name in the headline. "Gerald," she said. Outside the boardroom windows, a camera crew was setting up near the building entrance. Clara's driver called. There were people outside her condo building in Waterloo too. Her phone kept lighting up. The board members were talking quietly at the other end of the room. I looked at the ring on my hand, then at the certificate on the table. Paper had gotten us through the clause. Paper wasn't going to get us through this. Clara stood with her back very straight, doing the mental calculation of 10 problems at once. I picked up her portfolio and handed it to her. "You needed a husband by Monday," I said. She looked at me. "Pack a bag," I said. "You're staying at my place until this settles." She arrived at 9 that night, with a rolling suitcase, a garment bag, a tote full of files, and the expression of a woman who had survived a very expensive day and was now standing on a porch that didn't match anything else in her life. My house wasn't much to look at from the outside. Century home, narrow lot, the garden I hadn't finished, fixing since I'd bought the place 3 years ago. Inside it smelled like old wood and coffee, and the linseed oil I'd used on the floors the previous winter. Clara stood in the front hallway and looked around. The living room had exposed plaster I'd been deciding about for a year. The kitchen had one overhead light and a window that I kept meaning to reframe. "It's smaller than I expected," she said. "Good start." She caught herself. "I meant that as an observation, not a criticism." "You meant both." I picked up her suitcase. "Guest room's on the right. Window latch sticks. Lift it before you turn it. Heat comes slow in the morning, but it comes. Coffee maker works if you run it twice." She stood in the hallway a second longer. "You really do know how to make someone feel welcome." I'm new at this. The first week felt like sharing space with a storm that had agreed to use the front door. Clara had lawyers calling before 8, board messages all afternoon. Gerald's name in her inbox constantly. Trevor started answering the shop line with "Calloway Restoration, no statement available," even when it was a regular client asking about a door. At night, she sat at my kitchen table with files spread in careful rows while I ate leftovers across from her. She slept in the guest room. I slept badly. Nothing happened the way people probably imagined when they read the headline. No soft focus romance. No dramatic hallway moment. Mostly it was her stepping over my boots by the back door because I kept leaving them there, and me learning she needed 15 minutes of quiet in the morning before she was ready to talk to anyone. But things shifted, small things. She figured out the coffee maker's second run trick before I had to explain it. I noticed she drank her coffee black until about 9 p.m., at which point she added an amount of sugar that she clearly didn't want me to see. One evening I came in from the shop at 7:30 and found her standing on the bed in the guest room, trying to reach the top of the curtain rod. She'd decided the curtains needed adjusting and had found a way to do it that was technically functional and visually alarming. "What are you doing?" "Problem solving." "That rod's not anchored properly. I've been meaning to fix it." "You've been meaning to fix a lot of things in this house." "I've been busy being publicly married." She looked over her shoulder, and for a second she almost smiled, quick, surprised, real, before she went back to the curtain. I fixed the rod the next morning. She didn't say anything when she noticed, but she straightened the curtains 3 times that day in the way people do. When they're pleased about something, they're not going to admit. The following week, she showed up at the shop with coffee for everyone, not from a fancy place. The Tims on the corner, in the standard cardboard carrier, with names written on each cup in neat handwriting, because she'd asked Trevor the day before who drank what. Danny took his, looked at the name, looked at me. She remembered mine from last week. "She's thorough," I said. Trevor watched her talking to the apprentice about a window sash replacement she'd noticed in the corner and leaned close to me. "She's not what I thought." "What did you think?" "Rich problem with paperwork." "She is that." "Yeah, but she's listening to Kyle explain the sash thing like she actually wants to know." He paused. "That's different." 3 weeks in, I took her through the Elora mill. The building smelled like cool stone and old timber, and the particular silence of things that had been standing long enough to have opinions. The water wheel housing was still intact in the lower level. The original floor joists in the upper space were white oak, 200 years old, solid as the day they were cut. I walked her through it wall by wall. "This beam has some checking, but it's not structural. Don't let anyone tell you it needs to come out. They either haven't looked properly, or they want the billing hours." I ran my hand along a window casing on the north wall. "These are all original. Most of the glazing is repairable. Anyone who quotes you a full window replacement on this building is selling you something you don't need." She followed every word, not politely, like she was building a record. At the center of the upper floor I stopped and said, "Sloppy restoration is just a slower way of demolishing something." Clara looked at me for a moment. "My grandmother said something like that once." "Not those words." "Same idea." She looked up at the timber frame above us, the light coming through dirty glass onto the old floor. "She used to say that a building is just an argument against being forgotten." I didn't have an answer to that. After the mill, things were different between us. I couldn't have explained it in a way that would have meant anything in a boardroom, but it was there. She started leaving notes on my kitchen table when she found something in my client emails that needed fixing. Not lecturing, just a sticky note. "Too short. They'll think you're annoyed." One night she rewrote a whole proposal paragraph while I read over her shoulder. "You made me sound agreeable," I said. "You are agreeable, you just hide it. That's my business strategy." She looked up at me, and this time she did smile, properly, and it was different from the boardroom face. I fixed the curtain rod. Then the sticky back door latch. Then the kitchen light that had been buzzing for 4 months. She handed me screws when I asked, and in the wrong order every time, but with complete confidence, and I didn't correct her, because it was funnier not to. The ring stayed on my finger. I told myself it was practical. Cameras still showed up. Bored people were watching. Gerald kept leaking things to local bloggers. But there were plenty of evenings with no one around and no reason to perform anything, and I still hadn't taken it off. 6 weeks after the courthouse, Gerald forced an emergency board review. Fraud allegation, essentially. The claim was that the marriage was a staged arrangement, that Clara had circumvented the trust terms in bad faith, and that I was, his lawyer's exact phrasing, a contracted participant, not a genuine spouse. Clara arrived with Marianne and a folder of documentation. I arrived 20 minutes late from a site visit in Cambridge, still in my work clothes, and sat down next to Clara without apologizing for the timing. Gerald's lawyer asked the questions carefully. Where did we live? How were household decisions made? Did we intend for the marriage to continue beyond the estate clause expiry? Clara's back went straight. Before she could answer, I leaned forward. That depends, I said. Gerald looked at me. On what? On whether Clara stops taking my side of the kitchen table. I had a whole system before she moved in. Invoices on the left, parts list on the right. Coffee in the corner. Now there's a legal memo where my coffee goes, and I have to check 3 times before I put anything down. Nobody spoke for a moment. Patricia Feld at the head of the table, pressed her lips together, like she was deciding not to smile. Clara looked at the table surface, but I could see the corner of her mouth. It sounded true because it was true. Not in the way Gerald wanted to measure. In the way that her mug was on the left side of the dish rack every morning. In the way that I'd started listening for the sound of her car at the end of the day, and relaxed a fraction when I heard it. In the way that when Trevor asked me last week how things were going at home, I'd said fine, and actually meant it. The board didn't give Gerald his review, again. Afterward, Clara and I stood in an empty corridor outside the conference room. Her lawyer had gone ahead. Gerald was somewhere behind a closed door. No cameras, no board members, nobody watching. She stood beside me with her arms crossed, looking at the floor. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Make it sound real." I didn't make it sound like anything. She turned toward me slowly. There was no portfolio between us, no table, just the corridor and the specific quiet of late afternoon in an office building. "Seth," she said, quieter. She stepped forward and put one hand against my chest and kissed me. It wasn't strategy. It wasn't for the board, or for Gerald, or for any audience. It was the first thing in 2 months that belonged only to the two of us, and it felt like something unlocking. She pulled back and looked at me. "Neither of us said anything smart," I said. "We should probably leave before someone bills us for the hallway." She laughed, and her hand stayed on my jacket for one more second. On the drive home, she sat in the truck, instead of taking the car service, and every red light between Kitchener and Guelph was longer than it should have been. Back at the house, she set her bag on the kitchen chair and stood like she was waiting to see what kind of man I was going to be about this. I hung my jacket over the back of the chair. "We shouldn't rush it just because the courthouse got there first." Something in her face softened. "I was hoping you'd say that." "Don't look too relieved." "I'm not relieved. I'm just not used to things going slowly when they should." So we did it the only way that felt honest. Slowly. She stayed in the guest room for a while longer. I still made mediocre coffee. She still left sticky notes on my emails and pretended it was about the business. But when she passed behind my chair at the kitchen table, her hand touched my shoulder. When I came in late from a site, she looked up from whatever she was reading in the way that said she'd been aware of the time. Some evenings we sat on the back step after dinner, when the shop was quiet, talking about nothing Gerald could use and nothing a lawyer would need to file. The marriage stopped feeling like a structure we'd built for protection. It became a habit, then a choice, then something I couldn't imagine packing into a box. Gerald's challenges got smaller. His buyers stopped circling once. The board made clear that Clara's position was stable. The mill stayed off the market. So did the inn and the Prince Edward County property. One Thursday evening in November, I came home from a roofing assessment in Elora and found Clara at the kitchen table. No laptop, no files spread in rows, just one folder, centered, closed. She'd changed out of work clothes into jeans, and the old Callaway restoration hoodie she'd taken from the hook by the back door 2 weeks ago, and not returned. Her hair was down. Her face had the particular stillness of someone who had cried somewhere else, and decided they were done with it. "What's that?" I asked. She slid the folder toward the empty chair. "Annulment papers." The ceiling fan clicked above us. Outside, the first real cold of November was settling over the street. I didn't sit down. Clara kept her hands flat on the table. "Marianne reviewed everything. Your property is fully protected. The shop, the house, your equipment. There's no penalty and no required statement. The clause has expired. Gerald lost his strongest challenge. The board is stable." She stopped. "You did what I asked. More than I had any right to ask." "You practiced that," I said. "Yes." "How many times?" "More than I'm going to tell you." I pulled out the chair and sat across from her. She kept going. "I don't want you staying, because this started in a corner, and loyal people finish what they start. That's not a reason to stay in a marriage. You think that's what I'm doing. I think you're someone who keeps his word," she said, "and I think sometimes people who keep their word confuse obligation with choosing. That hit somewhere I wasn't expecting. I opened the folder, first page, names, dates, legal language, a clean path out of something that hadn't been cleaned for months. My grandfather's ring caught the overhead light as I turned the page. Clara saw me look at it. "You can keep wearing it," she said, "if you want. That's separate from." I closed the folder and slid it back across the table. "No," I said. She looked up. "No, listen." I set my hands on the table. "You walked into my shop and asked me what I wanted, not what I was willing to accept. That was day one, before I said yes. So here's mine." She didn't move. "I don't want the guest room empty," I said. "I don't want the table back the way it was. I don't want to make coffee without looking at your mug beside mine. I don't want to hear about that mill from a news article, because I'm not there anymore. I don't want to take this ring off and tell myself it was just a tool we used to beat Gerald." Her eyes went bright. "I was trying to be fair to you," she said, barely above a whisper. "I know. You're good at that." She looked at the folder, then pushed it sideways off the center of the table like it had been rude to sit there in the first place. "I don't want out either," she said. "Write in the comments. Was Clara right to give me the folder? Or should she have trusted that I was already staying because I chose to?" That was the moment it became real. Not in the courthouse, not in the boardroom, not when Gerald ran out of moves. It ended at a scratched kitchen table in a century home in Guelph, with November rain on the back steps, and Clara in a faded hoodie telling me the truth. After that, life didn't become easier exactly. It became ours. The mill restoration moved forward. I put in a bid and Clara made sure it landed. The inn on the escarpment got the structural review it had needed for years. The Prince Edward County farmhouse, which turned out to have original horsehair plaster in 3 rooms and a summer kitchen that nobody had touched since 1910, became the project Clara talked about most in the evenings. Trevor noticed the change before I said anything. He just started treating Clara like she'd always been part of the shop, the way he did with things that had been true long enough to stop needing acknowledgement. A year later, we had a real wedding. Small. The restored upper floor of the Elora mill, because Clara said it was only right and I didn't argue. Trevor was in the front row and definitely cried, which he will deny forever. Danny gave a toast that was 3 minutes too long and completely accurate. The apprentice wore a tie for the first time in his life and kept touching it like it was a foreign object. Clara walked in without the boardroom face, without the portfolio, without the careful distance she'd carried in every room before she'd learned she didn't need it here. I used my grandfather's ring again. This time, nobody said we could give it back. Later that evening we stood at the tall mill windows, while the October light dropped over the river below and came in gold across the floor we'd saved together. She leaned into my shoulder like it was the most obvious place in the world to be. Years later, when people asked about us, she always smiled before she answered. "I needed a husband by Monday," she'd say. And I'd tell them what happened next. I still think about the moment Clara slid that folder across the table. Not because it was dramatic, it wasn't, not really. It was quiet. November rain on the back steps, a ceiling fan clicking overhead, and a woman in my old shop hoodie, trying to give me a clean way out of something that had stopped feeling like an exit I wanted. What I've come to understand is that nothing about how that story ended was accidental. It didn't work out because we got lucky. It worked out because of choices, small ones, made consistently before anyone was watching. When Gerald sent a numbered corporation to buy my grandfather's property, I said no. Not because I had a better offer. Because the building wasn't mine to sell. It was built by someone I loved, and that meant something money couldn't reorganize. That decision, made alone, with no audience, years before Clara walked into my bay, was the reason she found me in the first place. She wasn't looking for someone impressive. She was looking for someone who couldn't be moved by the wrong things. Doing the right thing when it costs you something is never wasted, even when it looks like nothing is happening because of it. Clara could have walked into any boardroom in Southern Ontario and found someone with a better suit and a cleaner handshake. She didn't. She found someone covered in grease who asked her for the truth before he agreed to anything. That's not stubbornness. That's knowing what you're worth and not discounting it because someone with a leather portfolio is standing in front of you. She did the same thing when she pushed that folder toward me. She was smart enough to know that a marriage built on obligation wasn't a marriage at all, and brave enough to risk losing something she wanted in order to give me a real choice. That kind of clear thinking, even when it's painful, is what keeps people from building their lives on ground that won't hold. And then there's the part nobody talks about much. The part where you just keep showing up. I fixed the curtain rod. I drove her to the mill. I sat in that boardroom late and told the truth about the kitchen table, because it was true, not because it was strategic. Clara showed up at 7 in the morning, with Tim's for the whole crew and remembered everyone's order. She stood in a shop that wasn't hers and let people look at her until they decided for themselves what they thought. Neither of us made a grand gesture. We just didn't quit when it got uncomfortable, and we didn't pretend things were simpler than they were. I think about my grandfather's ring catching the light on that courthouse afternoon, and Clara's hand, not quite steady when she slid it on. Neither of us knew what we were doing. We just knew enough to be honest about that, and honest with each other, and to keep choosing the harder, truer thing when it would have been easier to stop. That's all it ever really is, I think. Not luck, not fate. Just a long series of small decisions that compound, quietly, without announcement, into something that lasts.